Toward the end of the winter, the Shtcherbatskys held a consultation of physicians in order to find out what was the state of Kitty's health, and what measures were to be taken to restore her strength. She was ill, and the approach of spring only increased her ailment. The family doctor had ordered cod liver oil, then iron, and last of all, nitrate of silver, but as none of these remedies did any good, and as he advised them to take her abroad, it was then resolved to consult a celebrated specialist. This celebrated doctor, still a young man, and very neat in his appearance, insisted on a careful investigation of the trouble. He with especial satisfaction, as it seemed, insisted that maidenly modesty is only a relic of barbarism, and that nothing is more natural than that a young man should make examination of a girl in undress. He found this natural because he did it every day, and he was conscious of no impropriety in it, as far as he could see, and, therefore, any sense of shame on the part of the girl he considered not only a relic of barbarism, but also an insult to himself. It was necessary to submit, since, notwithstanding the fact that all the other doctors were taught in the same school and studied the same books, and notwithstanding the fact that certain persons declared that this celebrated doctor was a bad doctor, yet in the princess's house and in her circle of friends it was admitted somehow that this celebrated doctor was the only one known who had the special knowledge, and was the only one who could save Kitty's life. After a careful examination and a prolonged thumping on the lungs of the poor sick girl, trembling with mortification, the celebrated physician carefully washed his hands, and returned to the drawing-room, and gave his report to the prince. The prince, with a little cough, listened to what he had to say, and frowned. He was a man of experience and brains, was in good health, and had no faith in medicine. He was all the more angry at this comedy, because possibly he alone understood what ailed his daughter. A regular humbug, thought the old prince, as he listened to the doctor's loquacity concerning the symptoms of his daughter's illness, mentally applying to the celebrated doctor a term from the vocabulary of hunting. The doctor, on his part, with difficulty disguised his disdain, with difficulty stooped to the low level of his intelligence, for this old gentleman. It seemed to him scarcely necessary to speak to the old man, since, in his eyes, the head of the house was the princess. He was ready to pour out before her all the floods of his eloquence. At this moment she came in with the family doctor. The prince left the room, so as not to show too clearly how ridiculous this whole comedy seemed to him. The princess was troubled, and did not know what course to take. She felt a little guilty in regard to Kitty. "Well, doctor, decide our fate," said the princess. "Tell me all." She wanted to say, "Is there any hope?" but her lips trembled, and she could not put the question to him. "Well, doctor?" "In a moment, princess, I shall be at your service, after I have conferred with my colleague. I shall then have the honour of giving you my opinion." "Do you wish to be alone?" "Just as you please." The princess sighed, and left the room. When the doctors were left alone, the family physician began timidly to express his opinion about her condition, and gave his reasons for thinking that it was the beginning of tubercular disease, but the celebrated physician listened, and in the midst of his diagnosis took out his great gold watch. "Yes," said he, "but—" The family physician stopped respectfully. "You know that we can hardly decide when tubercular disease first begins. In the present case apparently there is as yet no decided lesion. We can only surmise, and the symptoms are indigestion, nervousness, and others. The question, therefore, stands thus: what is to be done, granting that a tubercular development is to be feared, in order to superinduce improved alimentation?" "But you know well, in such cases there are always some moral or spiritual causes," said the family doctor, with a cunning smile. "Of course," replied the celebrated doctor, looking at his watch again. "Excuse me, but do you know whether the bridge over the Usa is finished yet, or whether one has to go around? Oh, it is finished, is it? Well, then I have 20 minutes left. We were just saying that the question remains thus: to improve the digestion and strengthen the nerves. The one is connected with the other, and it is necessary to act on both halves of the circle." "But the journey abroad?" "I am opposed to these journeys abroad. I beg you to follow my reasoning. If tubercular development has already set in, which we are not yet in a condition to prove, then a journey abroad would do no good. The main thing is to discover a means of promoting good digestion." And the celebrated doctor began to develop his plans for a cure by means of soda water, the principal merits of which were, in his eyes, their absolutely inoffensive character. The family doctor listened with attention and respect. "But I should urge in favour of a journey abroad the change of her habits and disassociation from the conditions that serve to recall unhappy thoughts. And finally, her mother wants her to go." "Ah, well, in that case let them go, provided always that those German charlatans do not aggravate her disease. They must follow. Yes, let them travel." And again he looked at his watch. "It is time for me to go," and he started for the door. The celebrated doctor explained to the princess that he wished to see the invalid once more. A sense of propriety dictated this. "What! Have another examination?" cried the princess with horror. "Oh, no, only a few minor points, princess." "Then come in, I beg of you." And the mother ushered the doctor into the drawing-room where Kitty was. Emaciated and flushed, with a peculiar gleam in her eyes, the result of the mortification she had borne, Kitty was standing in the middle of the room. When the doctor came in her eyes filled with tears, and she turned crimson. Her whole illness and the medical treatment seemed to her such stupid, even ridiculous nonsense. The medical treatment of her case seemed to her as absurd as to gather up the fragments of a broken vase. Her heart was broken, and could it be healed by pills and powders? But it was impossible to wound her mother's feelings, the more because her mother felt that she had been to blame. "Will you sit down, princess?" said the celebrated doctor. With a smile he sat down in front of her, felt her pulse, and with a smile began a series of wearisome questions. At first she replied to them, then suddenly arose impatiently. "Excuse me, doctor, but, indeed, this all leads to nothing. This is the third time you have asked me the same question." The celebrated doctor took no offence. "It is her nervous irritability," he remarked to the princess when Kitty had gone from the room. "However, I had finished." And the celebrated doctor explained the young princess's condition to her mother, treating her as a woman of remarkable intelligence, and concluded with directions how to drink those waters which were valueless. On the question, "Is it best to take her abroad?" the doctor pondered deeply, as if he were deciding a difficult problem. The decision was at last expressed. "Go, but put no faith in the charlatans, and consult him in everything." After the doctor's departure, everyone felt as if something jolly had happened. The mother, in much better spirits, rejoined her daughter, and Kitty declared that she was better already. Often, almost all the time, of late, she had felt obliged to pretend. "Truly, I am well, maman, but if you desire it, let us go," she said, and in her endeavour to show that she was interested in the journey, she began to speak of their preparations. Shortly after the doctor went, Dolly came. She knew that the consultation was to take place that day, and though she was as yet scarcely able to go out, having had a little daughter toward the end of the winter, and although she had many trials and cares of her own, she left her nursing baby and one of the little girls who was ailing, and came to learn what Kitty's fate should be. "Well, how is it?" she said, as she came into the drawing-room with her hat on. "You are all happy? Then all is well?" They endeavoured to tell her what the doctor had said, but it seemed that, although the doctor had spoken very fluently and lengthily, no one was able to tell what he had said. The only interesting point was the decision in regard to the journey abroad. Dolly sighed involuntarily. Her sister, her best friend, was going away, and life for her was not joyous. Her relations with Stepan Arkadyevitch since the reconciliation had become humiliating. The union brought about by Anna had not been of long duration, and the family concord had broken down in the same place. There was nothing definite, but Stepan Arkadyevitch was scarcely ever at home. There was scarcely ever any money in the house, and suspicions of his unfaithfulness constantly tormented Dolly, but she kept driving them away in terror of the unhappiness which jealousy caused her. The first explosion of jealousy, having been lived down, could not indeed be experienced again, and even the discovery of his unfaithfulness could not have such an effect on her as it had the first time. Such a discovery now would only break up the family, and she preferred to shut her eyes to his deception, despising him, and above all herself, because of this weakness. Moreover, the cares of a numerous family constantly annoyed her. First the nursing of her baby was unsatisfactory, then the nurse went off, and now one of the children was ill. "And how are the children?" asked the princess. "Ach, maman, we have so many tribulations. Lily is ill in bed, and I'm afraid it is the scarlatina. I came out now to see how you were, for there'll be no getting out for me after this, if it is the scarlatina, which God forbid." The old prince also, after the doctor's departure, came out from his library, presented his cheek to Dolly, exchanged a few words with her, and then turned to his wife. "What decision have you come to? Shall you go? Well, and what are you going to do with me?" "I think, Alexander, that you had better stay at home." "Just as you please." "Mammon, why doesn't papa come with us?" said Kitty. "It would be gayer for him and for us." The old prince got up and smoothed Kitty's hair with his hand. She raised her head, and with an effort smiled as she looked at him. It always seemed to her that he understood her better than any one else in the family, though he did not say much. She was the youngest, and therefore her father's favourite daughter, and it seemed to her that his love made him clairvoyant. When she saw his kind blue eyes steadily fixed on her, it seemed to her that he read her very soul, and saw all the evil that was working there. She blushed, and bent toward him, expecting a kiss, but he only pulled her hair, saying, "These stupid chignons! One never gets down to the real daughter, but you caress the hair of departed females. Well, Dolinka," turning to his eldest daughter, "what is that trump of yours doing?" "Nothing, papa," said Dolly, perceiving that her father referred to her husband. "He is always away from home, and I scarcely ever see him," she could not refrain from adding with an ironical smile. "Has he not gone yet to the country to sell his wood?" "No, he is always putting it off." "Truly," said the old prince, "is he taking after me?" "I hear you," he said in reply to his wife, and sitting down. "And as for you, Katya," he said, addressing his youngest daughter, "do you know what you ought to do? Sometime, some fine morning, wake up and say, 'There, I am perfectly well and happy, papa, and we must go for our early morning walk in the cold,' ha?" What her father said seemed very simple, but at his words Kitty felt confused and disconcerted, like a convicted criminal. "Yes, he knows all, he understands all, and these words mean that I ought to overcome my humiliation, however great it has been." She could not summon up the courage to reply. She began to say something, but suddenly burst into tears and ran from the room. "Just like your tricks," said the princess to her husband angrily. "You always—" and she began one of her tirades. The prince listened for some time to her reproaches, and made no reply, but his face kept growing darker and darker. "She is so sensitive, poor little thing, so sensitive, and you don't understand how she suffers at the slightest allusion to the cause of her suffering. Ach, how mistaken we are in people!" said the princess. And by the change in the inflection of her voice Dolly and the prince perceived that she had reference to Vronsky. "I don't understand why there are not any laws to punish such vile, such ignoble men." "Ach, do hear her," said the prince with a frown, getting up from his chair and evidently anxious to make his escape, but halting on the threshold. "There are laws, Matushka, and if you force me to this I will tell you who is to blame in all this trouble. You alone. There are laws against such young fops, and there always will be. And if things had not been as they ought never to have been, old man that I am, I should have put that dandy on the fence. Yes, and now to cure her, you bring in these quacks." The prince would have had still more to say, but as soon as the princess heard his tone she immediately became humble and repentant, as always happened when important questions came up. "Alexander, Alexander," she murmured, going up to him and weeping. The prince held his peace when he saw her tears. He went to meet her. "Well, let it go, let it go. I know that it is hard for you also. What is to be done? There is no great harm. God is merciful. Thank you," said he, not knowing what he said, and replying to the princess's damp kiss which he felt on his hand. Then the prince left the room. As soon as Kitty, weeping, had left the room, Dolly, with her maternal domestic instinct, perceived that this was an affair which required a woman's management, and she was preparing to follow her. She took her hat, and morally tucking up her sleeves, prepared to act. But when her mother began to attack her father, she tried to restrain her, as far as her filial respect allowed. When the prince's outburst occurred, she said nothing. She was ashamed for her mother, and she felt a deep affection because of the instant return of his good nature. But when he went out, she determined to do the chief thing that was necessary, to go to Kitty and calm her. "I have long wanted to tell you, maman. Did you know that when Levin was here the last time, he intended to offer himself to Kitty? He told Stiva." "What is that? I do not understand." "Then perhaps Kitty refused him. Didn't she tell you?" "No, she did not say anything to me about either of them. She is too proud. But I know that all of this comes from—" "Yes, but think, if she refused Levin, I know that she would not have done so if it had not been for the other one, and then he deceived her so abominably." It was terrible to the princess to think how blameworthy she had been toward her daughter, and she grew angry. "Ach, I do not know anything about it. Nowadays every girl wants to live as she pleases, and not to say anything to her mother, and so it comes that—" "Maman, I am going to see her." "Go, I will not prevent you," said her mother. As she entered Kitty's pretty little rosy boudoir, with figurines in vieux saxe, a room as youthful, as rosy, as gay as Kitty herself had been 2 months before, Dolly remembered with what pleasure and interest the two had decorated it the year before. How happy and gay they were then! She felt a chill at her heart as she saw her sister sitting on a low chair near the door, her motionless eyes fixed on a corner of the carpet. Kitty glanced up at her sister, but the cold and rather stern expression of her face underwent no change. "I am going now, and I may be confined at home, and it will be impossible for you to see me," said Darya Alexandrovna, sitting down near her sister. "I wanted to have a little talk with you." "What about?" asked Kitty, quickly raising her head in alarm. "What else than about your sorrow?" "I have no sorrow." "That'll do, Kitty. Do you really imagine that I don't know? I know everything, and believe me, this is such a trifle. All of us have been through this." Kitty said nothing, and her face resumed its severe expression. "He is not worth the trouble that you have given yourself because of him," continued Darya Alexandrovna, coming right to the point. "Yes, because he jilted me," murmured Kitty with trembling voice. "Don't speak of it, please don't speak of it." "But who said that to you? No one said such a thing. I am sure that he was in love with you, that he is still in love with you, but—" "Ah, nothing exasperates me so as compassion!" cried Kitty in a sudden rage. She turned around in her chair, flushed scarlet, and moved her belt buckle back and forth from one hand to the other, clutching it in her fingers. Dolly well knew this habit of her sister when she was provoked. She knew that she was capable of forgetting herself and saying harsh and cruel things in moments of petulance, and she tried to calm her, but it was too late. "What do you wish me to understand? What is it?" cried Kitty, talking fast. "That I was in love with a man who did not care for me, and that I am dying of love for him? And it is my sister who says this to me, my sister who thinks that she is showing me her sympathy. I hate such sympathy and such hypocrisy." "Kitty, you are unjust." "Why do you torment me?" "Why, on the contrary, I saw you were sad." Kitty, in her anger, did not heed her. "I have nothing to break my heart over, and need no consolation. I am too proud to ever love a man who does not love me." "Well, I do not say—" "I say only one thing. Tell me the truth," added Darya Alexandrovna, taking her hand. "Tell me, did Levin speak to you?" At the name of Levin, Kitty lost all control of herself. She sprang up from her chair, threw the buckle on the floor, and with quick, indignant gestures cried, "Why do you speak to me of Levin? I don't see why you need to torment me. I have already said, and I repeat it, that I am proud, and never, never would I do what you have done, go back to a man who had been false to me, who had made love to another woman. I do not understand this. You can, but I cannot." As she said these words, she looked at her sister, and seeing that Dolly bent her head sadly without answering, she sat down near the door again, and hid her face in her handkerchief instead of leaving the room as she had intended to do. The silence lasted several minutes. Dolly was thinking of herself. Her humiliation, of which she was always conscious, appeared to her more cruel than ever, thus recalled by her sister. She did not expect such bitterness from her sister, and it made her angry. But suddenly she heard the rustling of a dress, a broken sob, and some one's arms were thrown around her neck. Kitty was on her knees before her. "Dolinka, I am so unhappy," she murmured in exculpation, and her pretty face, wet with tears, was hid in Dolly's skirt. Those tears were evidently the indispensable lubricant without which the machinery of mutual communion between the two sisters could not work. At all events, after a good cry, they spoke no more on the subject which interested them both, but even while they were talking about irrelevant topics, they understood each other. Kitty knew that the cruel words that she had uttered in her anger about the husband's unfaithfulness, the unfaithfulness of Dolly's husband, and her humiliation, struck deep into her poor sister's heart, but that she forgave her. Dolly, on her side, knew all that she wanted to know. She was convinced that her suspicions were correct, that the pain Kitty felt, the irremediable pain, lay in the fact that Levin had offered himself to her, and that she had refused him, and that Vronsky had played her false, and that she was ready to love Levin and to hate Vronsky. Kitty said not a word about this. She spoke only of the general state of her soul. "I have no sorrow," she said, regaining her calmness a little. "But you cannot imagine how wretched, disgusting, and vulgar everything seems to me, above all myself. You cannot imagine what evil thoughts come into my mind." "Yes, but what evil thoughts can you have?" asked Dolly with a smile. "The most abominable, the most repulsive. I cannot describe them to you. It is not melancholy, and it is not ennui. It is much worse. It is as if all the good that was in me had disappeared, and only the evil was left. Now how can that be, I tell you?" she asked, looking in perplexity into her sister's eyes. "Papa began to say something to me a few minutes ago. It seems to me he thinks that all I need is a husband. Mamma takes me to the ball. It seems to me that she takes me there for the sole purpose of getting rid of me, of getting me married as soon as possible. I know that it is not true, and yet I cannot drive away these ideas. So-called marriageable young men are unendurable to me. It always seemed to me that they are taking my measure. A short time ago, to go anywhere in a ball gown was a simple delight to me. I admired myself. I enjoyed it. Now it is a bore to me, and I feel ill at ease. Now, what do you think? The doctor. Well—" Kitty stopped. She wanted to say further that, since she had felt this great change in herself, Stepan Arkadyevitch had become unendurably distasteful to her, that she could not see him without the most repulsive and unbecoming conjectures arising in her mind. "Indeed, everything takes the most repulsive, disgusting aspect in my sight," she continued. "It is a disease. Perhaps it will pass away. But don't for a moment think. I cannot help it. I do not feel at ease except with you and the children. What a pity that you can't come home with me now." "Well, I will go. I've had scarlatina. I will persuade maman." Kitty insisted so eagerly that she was allowed to go to her sister's, and throughout the course of the disease, which proved to be the scarlatina, she looked after the children. The two sisters successfully nursed all the 6 children, but Kitty's health did not improve, and at Lent the Shtcherbatskys went abroad. The highest Petersburg society is remarkably united. Everyone knows everyone else, and everyone exchanges visits. But in this great circle there are subdivisions. Anna Arkadyevna Karenina had friends and close relations with 3 different circles. One was the official circle, to which her husband belonged, composed of his colleagues and subordinates, bound together, or even further subdivided, by the most varied and often the most capricious social relations. It was now difficult for Anna to call back the sentiment of almost religious respect which at first she felt for all these personages. Now she knew them all, as one knows people in a provincial city. She knew what habits and weaknesses were characteristic of each, and what feet the shoe pinched. She knew what were their relations among themselves and to the official centre. She knew how this one agreed with that and on what grounds, and how another disagreed with still another and wherefore. But this administrative clique, to which her husband belonged, could never interest her, in spite of the Countess Lidia Ivanovna's suggestions, and she avoided it. The second circle in which Anna moved was that which had helped Alexey Alexandrovitch in his career. The centre of this circle was the Countess Lidia Ivanovna. It was composed of aged, ugly, charitable and devout women, and intelligent, learned and ambitious men. One of the cleverer men who belonged to this circle had called it the conscience of Petersburg society. Karenin was very much devoted to this circle, and Anna, who had the faculty of getting along with all people, had, during the early days of her life in Petersburg, made friends in its number. After her return from Moscow, this set of people seemed to her insupportable. It seemed as if she herself, as well as all the rest of them, were hypocritical, and she felt depressed and ill at ease in this society. She saw the Countess Lidia as infrequently as she possibly could. Finally, the third circle in which Anna had connections was society. Properly speaking, the fashionable society of balls, dinner parties, brilliant toilets, the society with which one hand lays fast hold of the court lest it descend to the level of the demi-mode, which the members of this circle affect to despise, and yet whose tastes are not only similar, but the same. The bond that united her to this society was the Princess Betsy Tverskaya, the wife of one of her cousins, who enjoyed an income of 120,000 rubles, and who had taken a great fancy to Anna as soon as she came to Petersburg, flattered her, introduced her among her friends, and made ridicule of the Countess Lidia's friends. "When I am old and ugly I will do the same," said Betsy, "but a young and pretty woman like yourself has as yet no place in such an asylum." Anna had at first avoided as far as possible the society to which the Princess Betsy Tverskaya belonged, as it called for expenses beyond her means, and in her heart she preferred the first mentioned courtier. But after her visit to Moscow all this was changed. She neglected her worthy old friends, and cared to go only into grand society. There she met Vronsky, and experienced tumultuous pleasure in these meetings. They met with especial frequency at the house of Betsy, who was a Vronskaya before her marriage, and was an old cousin of the Count. Vronsky went everywhere that he was likely to meet Anna, and if possible, spoke to her of his love. She gave him no encouragement, but every time she met him there flamed up in her soul the same sense of animation which had seized her the moment that they met, for the first time, on the train at Moscow. She herself was conscious that at the sight of him this joy shone in her eyes, in her smile, but she had not the power to hide it. Anna at first sincerely believed that she was angry because he persisted in following her, but one evening, not long after her return from Moscow, when she was present at a house where she expected to meet him, and he failed to come, she perceived clearly, by the pang that went through her heart, that she was deceiving herself, that this insistence of his not only was not disagreeable to her, but that it formed the ruling passion of her life. A famous diva was singing for the second time, and all the high society of Petersburg was at the theatre. Vronsky, from his seat in the front row, saw his cousin there, and without waiting for the entr'acte, left to visit her box. "Why didn't you come to dinner?" she asked, and then with a smile she added, so as to be heard only by him, "I admire this clairvoyance of lovers. She was not there. But come to my house after the opera." Vronsky looked at her questioningly. She nodded. He thanked her with a smile, and sat down by her side. But how I miss your pleasantries! What has become of them?" continued the Princess Betsy, who followed with keen pleasure the progress of this passion. "You are in the toils, my dear." "That is all that I ask for," he replied with his calm good-natured smile, "to be in the toils. If I complain it is not because I am too little in the toils, if the truth must be told. I am beginning to lose hope." "What hope could you have?" asked Betsy, taking the part of her friend. "Let us have a clear understanding." But the fire in her eyes told with sufficient clearness that she understood as well as he did what his hope meant. "None," replied Vronsky, laughing, and showing his regular white teeth. "Excuse me," he added, taking the opera-glasses from his cousin's hand, in order to direct it across her bare shoulder at one of the opposite boxes. "I fear I am becoming ridiculous." He knew very well that in Betsy's eyes, and in those of her world, he ran no risk of being ridiculous. He knew very well that in the eyes of such people, the rôle of an unsuccessful lover of a young girl or an unmarried woman might be ridiculous, but not so the rôle of a man who pursues a married woman, and at any price makes it his aim to lead her into committing adultery. This rôle is something beautiful and majestic, and can never be ridiculous, and therefore Vronsky, as he handed back the opera-glasses, looked at his cousin with a smile of pride and joy lurking under his moustache. "And why didn't you come to dinner?" she asked again, unable to refrain from admiration of him. "I must tell you, I was busy. And what about? I will give you one guess out of 100, out of 1,000, and you will never hit it. I have been reconciling a husband with his wife's persecutor. Yes, fact." "What, and you reconcile them?" "Pretty nearly." "You must tell me all about it," said Betsy, rising. "Come during the next entr'acte." "Impossible. I am going to the French theatre." "From Nilsson?" said Betsy with horror, though she could not have distinguished Nilsson from the poorest chorus singer. "But what can I do? I have made an appointment in order to finish my act of peacemaking." "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be saved," said Betsy, remembering that she had heard somewhere some such quotation. "Well, then, sit down and tell me all about it." And she resumed her seat. "It's a little improper, but so amusing, that I wanted awfully to tell you about it," said Vronsky, looking at her with sparkling eyes. "However, I will not mention any names." "But I can guess. So much the better." "Listen, then. 2 gay young men were dining." "Officers of your regiment, of course." "I did not say that they were officers, but simply young men who had dined well." "Translated, tipsy." "Possibly. They went to dine with a comrade in most excellent spirits. They saw a pretty young woman passing them in a hired carriage. She turns around and, as it seems to them, nods to them and laughs. Of course they follow her. They gallop like mad. To their amazement their beauty stops at the entrance of the very house where they are going. She mounts to the upper floor, and they see nothing but a pair of rosy lips under a short veil, and a pair of pretty little feet." "You describe the scene with so much feeling that you make me believe that you were in the party." "Why do you accuse me so soon? Well, the 2 young men climb up to their comrade's room, where there is to be a farewell dinner, and there they drink, perhaps more than is good for them, as is usually the case at farewell dinners. And at dinner they ask who lives on the top story of the house. No one knows anything about it. Only their friend's valet, to their questions, "Do any mamsells live on the top floor?" replies that there are a good many. After dinner the 2 young men go into their friend's library and write a letter to the unknown. They write a passionate letter, a declaration. They themselves carry up the letter, in order to explain whatever in the letter might not be perfectly understood. "But why do you tell me such horrible things? Well?" "They ring. A girl comes to the door. They give her the letter, telling her that they are so desperately in love that they are ready to die, there at the door. The girl is in doubt, and parleys with them. Suddenly a gentleman appears, red as a lobster, and with side whiskers like sausages, declares that there is no one there except his wife, and unceremoniously puts them out of the door." "How did you know that his side whiskers were like sausages?" "But now listen. I have just made peace between them." "Well, what came of it?" "This is the most interesting part of the affair. The happy couple proved to be a titular councillor and his wife. The titular councillor brings a complaint, and I am obliged to serve as peacemaker. What a peacemaker! I assure you Talleyrand compared to me was nobody." "What were your difficulties?" "Here now, listen. We make excuses as in duty bound, as 'We are desperately sorry,' we said. 'We beg you to pardon us for this unfortunate misunderstanding.' The titular councillor with the sausage whiskers seemed to be thawing, but he felt it necessary to express his feelings, and as soon as he began to express his feelings he began to get wrathy and to say harsh things, and again I was obliged to bring all my diplomatic talents into requisition. I agree that their conduct was reprehensible, but please take into consideration that there was a misunderstanding. They were young and had just come from a good dinner. You understand. Now they are sorry from the bottom of their hearts, and beg you to forgive them their fault." The titular councillor was softened still more. "I agree with you, Count, and I am ready to pardon them, but you perceive that my wife, a virtuous woman, has been exposed to insult, to persecution, and to the impudence of a good-for-nothing young and the impudent good-for-nothing young fellows being present, I had to exert myself to calm them down. Again I put my diplomacy to work, and every time I seem on the point of success my titular councillor gets wrathy again, and his face gets red, and his sausages begin to wag up and down, and I find myself drowned in the waves of diplomatic subtleties." "Ach, we must tell you all about this," said Betsy to a lady who at that moment came into her box. "It has amused me so much. Well, good luck go with you," she added, giving Vronsky one of her fingers as she held her fan; and then, shrugging her shoulders so as to keep the waist of her gown from coming up, so that she might be as naked as possible when she should go to the front of the box, and sit down in the full blaze of gas and in the eyes of all. Vronsky went to the French theatre, where he really had to meet his regimental commander, who never failed to be present at a single representation. He wished to speak with him in regard to his business as peacemaker, which had occupied and amused him for 3 days. Petritsky, whom he liked, was involved in this affair, and the other one was a charming, a glorious fellow, young Prince Kurdov, who had lately joined their regiment. But the principal point was that the affair concerned the interests of his regiment. Both the young men belonged to Vronsky's company. Vendin, the titular councillor, had come to the regimental commander with a complaint that the officers had insulted his wife. His young wife, Vendin said he had been married only half a year, had been to church with her mother, and, feeling indisposed, owing to her delicate condition, so that she could not stand any longer, had engaged the first decent isvostchik at hand. The officers had chased her. She was frightened, and, feeling still more ill, had run up the stairs. Vendin himself, who had just returned from his office, heard the sound of a bell and voices. He came out, and, seeing drunken officers with a letter, he had them put out. He demanded that they should be severely punished. "No, it's all very well to talk," said the regimental commander to Vronsky, whom he had asked to join him. "But Petritsky is becoming unbearable. Not a week passes without some scandal. This chinovnik will not stop here, he will go farther." Vronsky saw all the unpleasantness of this affair, and he felt that a duel should be avoided, and that everything should be done to make the titular councillor relent and smooth over the scandal. The regimental commander and Vronsky both realized that Vronsky's name and his Flugel adjutant's monogram ought to have a great effect in soothing the titular councillor. In reality these two influences proved partially efficacious, but the results of the reconciliation remained in doubt, as Vronsky said. When he reached the French theatre, Vronsky took the regimental commander into the lobby and told him of his success, or rather lack of success. After reflection the regimental commander decided to leave the matter in abeyance, but afterwards he began to question Vronsky regarding the details of the interview, and he could not help laughing as he heard Vronsky tell how the titular councillor kept suddenly flaming out in wrath as he recalled the particulars of the affair, and how Vronsky, veering round at the last mention of reconciliation, had withdrawn, pushing Petritsky before him, and his repeated attempts to bring him into a suitable frame of mind. It is a wretched piece of business, but comical enough. Karadov cannot fight with this gentleman. Was he so horribly angry?" he asked, laughing. "And how do you like Claire this evening? Charming," he said, referring to a new French actress. "One can't see her too often. She is always new. Only the French can do that." The Princess Betsy left the theatre without waiting for the end of the last act. She had scarcely had more than time enough, after reaching home, to go into her dressing-room and scatter a little rice powder over her long pale face, rearrange her toilet, and order tea to be served in the large drawing-room, when the carriages began one after another to arrive at her enormous house on the Bolshaya Morskaya. The guests came up to the wide entrance, and a portly Swiss, who during the morning read the newspaper for the edification of passers-by, as he sat behind the glass door, now kept noiselessly opening this great door and admitting the visitors. They came in by one door almost at the same instant that by another came the mistress of the mansion, with renewed colour and hair rearranged. The walls of the great drawing-room were hung with sombre draperies, and on the floor were thick rugs. On the table, which was covered with a cloth of dazzling whiteness, shining in the light of numberless candles, stood a silver samovar and a tea-service of transparent porcelain. The princess took her place behind the samovar, and drew off her gloves. With the help of attentive servants, the guests brought up chairs and took their places, dividing into two camps, the one around the princess, and the other at the opposite end of the drawing-room around the wife of a foreign ambassador, a handsome lady dressed in black velvet and with black, well-defined eyebrows. The conversation, as usual at the beginning of a reception, was desultory, being interrupted by the arrival of newcomers, offers of tea, and the exchange of salutations, and seemed to be endeavouring to find a common subject of interest. "She is remarkably handsome for an actress. You can see that she has studied Kaulbach," said a diplomat in the group around the ambassador's wife. "Did you notice how she fell?" "Ach, please let us not speak of Nilsson. Nothing now can be said about her," said a great fat lady with a light complexion, without either eyebrows or chignon, and dressed in an old silk gown. This was the Princess Myakaya, famous for her simplicity and frightful manners, and surnamed the Enfant Terrible. Princess Myakaya was seated between the two groups, listening to what was said on both sides of her, and taking impartial interest in both. This very day 3 people have made that same remark about Kaulbach. It must be fashionable. I don't see why that phrase should be so successful." The conversation was cut short by this remark, and a new theme had to be started. "Tell us something amusing, but don't let it be naughty," said the ambassador's wife, who was a mistress of the art of conversation called, by the English, small talk. She was addressing the diplomatist, who was at a loss what topic to start. "They say this is very hard, that only naughty things are amusing," replied the diplomatist, with a smile. "However, I will do my best. Give me a theme. Everything depends upon the theme. When you get that for a background, you can easily fill it in with embroidery. I often think that the celebrated talkers of the past would be exceedingly embarrassed if they were so alive now. Everything intellectual is considered so dull." "That was said long ago," remarked the ambassador's wife, interrupting him with a smile. The conversation began amiably, and for the very reason that it was too amiable, it languished again. It was necessary to have recourse to an unfailing, never-changing subject, gossip. "Don't you think that there is something Louis XV about Tushkevitch?" asked he, indicating a handsome, light-haired young man who was standing near the table. "Oh, yes. He's quite in the style of the drawing-room, and that's why he is here so often." This subject sustained the conversation, since it consisted wholly of hints regarding something which could not be treated openly in that drawing-room, in other words, Tushkevitch's relations with the Princess Betsy. Around the samovar the conversation hesitated for some time upon 3 inevitable subjects: the news of the day, the theatre, and a lawsuit which was to be tried the next day. At last the same subject arose that was occupying the other group, gossip. "Have you heard that Maltischeva, that is the mother, not the daughter, has had a costume in Diable Rose?" Is it possible? No, this is delicious. I am astonished that with her sense, for she is certainly not stupid, she does not perceive how ridiculous she is. Every one found something in which to criticize and tear to pieces the unfortunate Madame Maltischeva, and the conversation grew lively, brilliant, and gay, like a flaming pyre. The Princess Betsy's husband, a tall, good-natured man, a passionate collector of engravings, hearing that his wife had guests, came into the drawing-room before going to his club, and desired to show himself in her circle. Noiselessly, on the thick carpet, he approached the Princess Myakaya. "How did you like Nilsson?" he asked. "Ach, do you steal upon a body that way? How you startled me!" she cried. "Don't speak to me about the opera, I beg you. You don't know anything about music. I prefer to descend to your level, and talk with you about your engravings and majolikas. Well, what treasures have you discovered lately?" "If you would like, I will show them to you, but you are no judge of them." "Show them to me, all the same. I am getting my education among these bankers, as you call them. They have lovely engravings. They like to show them." "Have you been at the Schutzburgs?" asked the mistress of the house, from her place by the samovar. "Certainly, ma chère. They invited my husband and me to dinner, and they told me the sauce at this dinner cost 1,000 roubles," replied the Princess Myakaya in a loud voice, conscious that all were listening to her. "And it was a very poor sauce too, something green. I had to return the compliment, and I got them up a sauce that cost 85 kopecks, and all were satisfied. I can't make 1,000-rouble sauces." "She is unique," said the hostess. "Astonishing," said another. The Princess Myakaya never failed of making her speeches effective, and the secret of their effectiveness lay in the fact that, although she did not always select suitable occasions, as was the case at the present time, yet she spoke simply and sensibly. In the society where she moved, what she said gave the effect of the most subtle wit. She could not comprehend why it had such an effect, but she recognized the fact, and took advantage of it. While the Princess Myakaya was speaking, all listened to her, and the conversation around the ambassador's wife stopped, so the hostess, wishing to make the conversation more united, turned to the ambassador's wife and said, "Are you sure that you will not have some tea? Then please join us." "No, we are very well where we are, in this corner," replied the ambassador's wife, with a smile, resuming the thread of conversation which interested her very deeply. They were criticizing Karenin and his wife. "Anna is very much changed since her return from Moscow. There's something strange about her," said one of her friends. "The change is due to the fact that she brought back in her train the shadow of Alexey Vronsky," said the ambassador's wife. "What is that? There's a story in Grimm, a man without a shadow, a man deprived of his shadow. It was a punishment for something or other. I cannot see where the punishment lies, but it must be disagreeable for a woman to be without her shadow." "Yes, but the women who have shadows generally come to some bad end," said Anna's friend. "Hold your tongues!" cried the Princess Myakaya, as she heard these words. "Madame Karenina is a charming woman. I don't like her husband, but I like her." "Why don't you like her husband?" asked the ambassador's wife. "He is such a remarkable man. My husband says there are few statesmen in Europe equal to him." "My husband says the same thing, but I don't believe it," replied the Princess Myakaya. "If our husbands had not had this idea, we should have seen Alexey Alexandrovitch as he really is, and in my opinion he is a blockhead. I only say this in a whisper. Is it not true how everything comes out clearly? Formerly when I was told that he was clever, I used to try to discover it, and I came to the conclusion that I was stupid because I could not see wherein he was clever. But as soon as I said to myself, under my breath, he is stupid, all was explained. Isn't that so?" "How severe you are to-night." "Not at all. I have no other alternative. One of us two is stupid. Now you know that one can never say such a thing of oneself." "No one is satisfied with his circumstances, and every one is satisfied with his brain," said a diplomat, quoting a French couplet. "There, that is the very thing!" exclaimed the Princess Myakaya, turning to him. "But I make an exception of Anna. She is so lovely and good. Is it her fault if all men fall in love with her and follow her like shadows?" "Well, I do not allow myself to judge her," said Anna's friend, justifying herself. "Because no one follows us like a shadow, it does not prove that we have the right to judge." Having thus appropriately disposed of Anna's friend, the Princess Myakaya arose, and with the ambassador's wife drew up to the table, and joined in the general conversation about some trifle. "Whom have you been gossiping about?" asked Betsy. "About the Karenins. The princess has been picturing Alexey Alexandrovitch," replied the ambassador's wife, sitting down near the table with a smile. "Shame that we could not have heard it," said Betsy, looking toward the door. "Ah, here you are at last," said she, turning to Vronsky, who at that moment came in. Vronsky knew, and met every day, all the people whom he had found collected in his cousin's drawing‐room. Therefore he came in with the calmness of a man who rejoins his friends from whom he has only just parted. "Where have I come from?" said he, in reply to a question from the ambassador's wife. "What can I do? I must confess, from Le Boeuf. 'Tis for the 100th time, and always with a new pleasure. It is charming. It is humiliating, I know, but I get sleepy at the opera. But at Le Boeuf I sit it out up to the very last minute, and enjoy it. To-night—" He mentioned a French actress, and was going to tell some story about her, but the ambassador's wife stopped him with an expression of mock terror. "Please don't speak to us of that fright." "Well, I will not, and the more willingly because you all know these frights." "And you would not go there if it were as fashionable as the opera," added the Princess Myakaya. Steps were heard near the door, and the Princess Betsy, knowing that it was Madame Karenina, looked at Vronsky. He was looking toward the door, and his face had a strange, new expression. Joyfully, expectantly, and almost timidly, he gazed at Anna as she entered, and he rose slowly. Anna came into the drawing-room, as always holding herself very erect and looking neither to right nor to left. She crossed the short distance between her and the hostess, with that rapid, light, but decided step which distinguished her from all the other women of this circle. She went directly up to Betsy and shook hands with a smile, and with the same smile she looked at Vronsky. He bowed low and offered her a chair. She responded only by bending her head a little, and blushed, and frowned. But instantly she was nodding to her acquaintances, and shaking hands. Then she turned to Betsy. "I have been at the Countess Lydia's. I wanted to get away earlier, but I was detained. Sir John was there. He was very interesting." "Oh, that missionary?" "Yes, he related many curious things about life in India." The conversation, which Anna's entrance had interrupted, again wavered, like the flame of a lamp in a draught. "Sir John? Yes, Sir John. I have seen him. He speaks well. The Vlasova is actually in love with him." "Is it true that the youngest Vlasova is going to marry Topov?" "Yes, people say that it is fully decided." "I am astonished at her parents. They say it is a love match." "A love match? What antediluvian ideas you have! Who speaks of love in our days?" said the ambassador's wife. "What is to be done about it? That foolish old custom is not entirely gone out of date," said Vronsky. "So much the worse for those who adhere to it. The only happy marriages that I know about are those of reason." "Yes, but how often it happens that these marriages of reason break like ropes of sand, precisely because of this love which you affect to scorn," said Vronsky. "But what we call a marriage of reason is where both parties take an equal risk. It is like scarlatina, through which we all must pass." "In that case it would be wise to find an artificial means of inoculation for love, as for smallpox." "When I was young I fell in love with a sacristan. I should like to know what good that did me," said the Princess Myakaya. "No, but jesting aside, I believe that to know what love really is, one must have been deceived once, and then been set right," said the Princess Betsy. "Even after marriage?" said the ambassador's wife, laughing. "It is never too late to mend," said the diplomatist, quoting the English proverb. "But really," interrupted Betsy, You must be deceived, so as afterwards to get into the right path. What do you think about this?" she said, addressing Anna, who was listening silently to the conversation, with a scarcely perceptible smile on her firm lips. "I think," said Anna, playing with her glove, which she had removed, "I think, if there are as many opinions as there are heads, then there are as many ways of loving as there are hearts." Vronsky looked at her, and with a violent beating of the heart, waited for her answer. After she had spoken these words, he drew a deep breath, as if he had escaped some danger. She turned suddenly to Vronsky. "I have just had a letter from Moscow. They write me that Kitty Shtcherbatskaya is very ill." "Really?" said Vronsky with a frown. Anna looked at him with a severe expression. "Doesn't that interest you?" "It certainly does. I am very sorry. Exactly what did they write you, if I may be permitted to inquire?" Anna arose and went to Betsy. "Will you give me a cup of tea?" she said, standing behind her chair. While Betsy was pouring the tea, Vronsky went to Anna. "What did they write you?" "I often think that men do not know what nobility means, though they are all the time talking about it," said Anna, not answering his question. "I have been wanting to tell you for a long time," she added, and taking a few steps she sat down at a corner table laden with albums. "I don't quite know what your words mean," he said, offering her a cup of tea. She glanced at the divan near her, and he instantly sat down on it. "Yes, I have been wanting to tell you," she continued without looking at him. "You have acted badly, very badly." "Don't I know that I have? But whose fault was it?" "Why do you say that to me?" said she with a severe look. "You know why," he replied boldly and jealously, meeting her gaze and without dropping his eyes. She, not he, felt confused. "This simply proves that you have no heart," said she. But her eyes told the story, and she knew that he had a heart, and therefore she feared him. "What you were talking about just now was error, not love." "Remember that I have forbidden you to speak that word, that hateful word," said Anna, trembling, and instantly she felt by the use of that one word "forbidden," she recognized a certain jurisdiction over him, and thus encouraged him to speak of love. "For a long time I have been wanting to say this to you," she continued, looking steadily into his eyes, and all aflame with the color that burned in her face. "I have come tonight on purpose, knowing that I should find you here. I have come to tell you this must come to an end. I have never had to blush before anyone before, and you somehow cause me to feel guilty in my own eyes." He looked at her, and was struck with the new spiritual beauty of her face. "What do you want me to do?" he said simply and gravely. "I want you to go to Moscow and beg Kitty's pardon." "You do not want that," said he. He saw that she was compelling herself to say one thing while she really desired something else. "If you love me, as you say you do," she murmured, "then do what will give me peace." Vronsky's face lighted up. "Don't you know that you are my life? But I don't know what peace means, and I can't give it to you. Myself, my love, I can give. Yes, I cannot think of you and myself separately. But for me, you and I are one. I see no hope of peace for you or for me in the future. I see the possibility of despair, of misfortune, unless I see the possibility of happiness, and what happiness! Is it really impossible?" he murmured, with lips only, but she heard him. She directed all the forces of her mind to say what she ought, but instead of that, she looked at him with love in her eyes, and said nothing. "Ah," he thought with rapture, "at the very moment when I was in despair, when it seemed I should never succeed, it has come. She loves me. She confesses it." "Then do this for me, and never speak to me in this way again. Let us be good friends," said her words. Her eyes told a totally different story. "We can never be mere friends. You yourself know it. Shall we be the most miserable or the happiest of human beings? It is for you to decide." She began to speak, but he interrupted her. You see I ask only one thing, the right of hoping and suffering as I do now. If it is impossible, order me to disappear, and I will disappear. You shall not see me if my presence is painful to you." "I do not wish to drive you away." "Then change nothing. Let things go on as they are," said he with a trembling voice. "Here is your husband." Indeed, Alexey Alexandrovitch at that instant was entering the drawing-room with his calm face and awkward gait. Glancing at his wife and Vronsky, he went first to the hostess, and then he sat down with a cup of tea, and in his slow, well-modulated voice, in his habitual tone of persiflage, which seemed always to deride some one or something, he said as he glanced around at the assembly, "Your Rambouillet is complete, the Graces and the Muses." But the Princess Betsy could not endure this sneering tone of his, as she called it, and, like a clever hostess, quickly brought him round to a serious discussion of the forced conscription. Alexey Alexandrovitch immediately entered into it, and began gravely to defend the new ukase against Betsy's attacks. Vronsky and Anna still sat near their little table. "That is getting rather pronounced," said a lady in a whisper, indicating with her eyes Karenina, Anna, and Vronsky. "What did I tell you?" said Anna's friend. Not only these ladies, but nearly all who were in the drawing-room, even the Princess Myakaya and Betsy herself, glanced more than once at them sitting apart from the general company, as if it disturbed them. Only Alexey Alexandrovitch never once looked in their direction, and was not diverted from the interesting conversation on which he had started. Betsy, perceiving the disagreeable impression that all felt, substituted some one else in her place to listen to Alexey Alexandrovitch, and crossed over to Anna. "I always admire your husband's clear and explicit language," she said. "The most transcendental thoughts seem within my reach when he speaks." "Oh yes," said Anna, with a radiant smile of joy, and not understanding a word that Betsy had said. Then she went over to the large table and joined in the general conversation. After he had stayed half an hour, Alexey Alexandrovitch spoke to his wife, and proposed to her that they should go home together, but she answered, without looking at him, that she wished to remain to supper. Alexey Alexandrovitch took leave of the company and departed. Madame Karenina's coachman, the portly old Tartar, in his lacquered leather coat, was having some difficulty in restraining his left-hand grey, which was excited with the cold. A lackey stood holding open the carriage door. The Swiss was standing ready to open the outer door. Anna Arkadyevna was listening with ecstasy to what Vronsky whispered, while she was freeing, with nervous fingers, the lace of her sleeve, which had caught on the hook of her fur cloak. "You have said nothing, let us admit, and I make no claim," Vronsky was saying, as he accompanied her down. "But you know that it is not friendship that I ask for. For me, the only possible happiness of my life is contained in that word that you do not like, love." "Love," she repeated slowly, as if she had spoken to herself. Then suddenly, as she disentangled her lace, she said, "I do not like this word because it means too much, far more than you can imagine." And she looked him full in the face. "Das Vidanya." She reached him with her hand, and, with a quick elastic step, passed the Swiss and disappeared in her carriage. Her look, her pressure of his hand, filled Vronsky with passion. He kissed the palm on the place which she had touched, and went home with the happy conviction that that evening had brought him nearer to the goal of which he dreamed than all the 2 months past.